Hello everybody and welcome to Elizabeth Unit 2 from the Carlton Academy. This is all about life in Elizabethan times. So what we're covering on this particular video is whether or not there was a golden age at this time, so looking at living standards, fashion, prosperity, rise of the gentry, theatre, the achievements of the theatre and the transformation that made on society and attitudes towards the theatre, including Puritan views of it. We're also going to have a look at the poor, reasons for the increase in poverty, attitudes and responses to poverty, the reasons why government action was taken at this point, and the seriousness of the problem of poverty. We're also going to have a look at exploration and English sailors, such as Hawkins and Drake, and the circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580. We're going to look at voyages and trade, and the role of Sir Walter Raleigh. This revision video revolves around the A3 revision sheets that you should have in your folder. There are 3 of them on this particular unit. The notes that are written in red as we go through this PowerPoint, as we go through this video, are additional points not on the sheets. So you'll need to be adding them with things like post-it notes, etc., or extra sheets of paper where you can add some extra details to this. Now, we all know that doing active revision is really important, and so just listening to this video and highlighting as you go through on your A3 sheets is a good start to your revision, but it might be a good idea to make something else. So what you might want to make is a mind map using these 12 headings here, or a revision clock, something that's going to make sure that you're using the knowledge and thinking about it and putting it into a different kind of format. Let's make a start then. So the first thing we're going to investigate is whether or not it was a golden age. So the first thing you have to do is find me your post-it notes or extra bits of paper and add this to the very beginning of this sheet. So Elizabeth's reign is often seen as a golden age of cultural achievement when new ideas flourished. The gentry built grand new homes and spent their money on impressive new clothes, art and theatre going. So that's the backbone of everything we're going to be looking at here with the golden age. So it's important that you pause this now and get those notes down. So if you have a look in the top left-hand corner of your A3 sheet, there's some information on the Great Chain of Being. So hopefully, as we can remember from when we did this together in class, Elizabethan society was extremely structured, much more structured than any societies that we live in today. People believed in a divine hierarchy. So this was known as the Great Chain of Being, and this had been created by God. That's why it's divine, it's created by God. This helped to keep order, as the people were expected to respect their place in society. You were born into a particular part of society, and that is where you're expected to be contented, to work, to contribute, and stay. However, during this particular period, this was becoming a little bit more fluid. So if we have a look there at the right hand side, we can see that the order that was supposed to exist. So this is the divine order. We've got God, the angels, and the monarch as that person chosen by God, Elizabeth I. And of course, if they're chosen by God, that means that nobody can actually question them, because by questioning the monarch, they're actually questioning God who chose them and is helping them with decision making. Beneath that, we've got the nobility. This is a small number of incredibly powerful, wealthy families. They had titles like lords, for example, passed from father to son, and they held most senior positions in places like the Privy Council. That was a tradition that had gone on for hundreds of years. Below that, we had the gentry. Now, this is a group that we're going to investigate a little further in a second. These were often wealthy landowners. They held important positions, such as justice of the peace. So these were people who were keeping law and order in the countryside and helping the nobility with their work. They might be richer, but they were still below the nobles. So this was a group who are becoming more fluid. Below that, we've got the peasantry. So this is the vast majority of the people. Now, this is a really wide-ranging group of people by this point as well, because some of the people in this group were people who were living in the towns and had made quite a lot of money from trade, but they still didn't really have any say or sway in terms of government and positions of power. And below that is the animals, plants and minerals. Sometimes in the Great Chain of Being, women are listed in that section as well. So how are things changing at this time? Well, things are changing at this time because of the rise of the gentry, and it shows that very clearly here on this box. So before the reign of Elizabeth, almost all wealth and power had been held by the nobility. However, the stability that Elizabeth's reign brought changed this. People had begun to make a lot of money from trade and exploration. So going to other parts of the world and setting up trading partnerships. Land was also more available to them because of the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, this had happened in the 1530s under the Henry VIII, but it was really becoming something of great importance at this time. So they'd bought up the land, but the value of land was rising in the time of Elizabeth. So these people were becoming richer and richer. They were also able to buy more and more of it. They grew rich during her reign because of the rising population and rising prices for houses. So they'd done things like built lots of houses in the towns, they rented them out, and the rents were becoming increasingly profitable. So this group were the ones who were investing in the right thing, who were buying money, buying land in the towns and the cities, building lots of homes. They were also building themselves nice houses out in the countryside, and all of this stuff was becoming of greater and greater value. By this point as well, and this was a tradition begun before Elizabeth's time, but members of the Privy Council were also promoted members of the gentry. So rather than relying on that nobility like the dukes, the earls, the absolute top echelons of society, Elizabeth was promoting those who were a little bit below that because she felt that they would be more grateful, they would be more loyal, and that the nobility were a little bit too powerful. Make sure that you pause this video and add the notes in red. Something else we need to know about this time is that there was a cult built around Elizabeth I. And sometimes the term Gloriana is used to describe the spreading of the message that this was a golden age, an age of change and culture and growth, and that Elizabeth was this magnificent monarch who had allowed all these developments to happen. And Elizabeth's advisors used culture as propaganda. So this propaganda took many forms, such as paintings, plays, books, poems, festivals. All of these promoted the positive messages of Elizabeth and were a useful way of securing Elizabeth's position and popularity. So lots and lots of different examples of this propaganda was being pumped out to the people. So some specific examples of this Gloriana: royal portraits. This was very, very important. These made clever use of symbols to create a mythical image of the Queen. So the rainbow portrait, which is there in the top right, where she's shown as having godlike status with her holding a rainbow. She wore expensive clothes and jewels. Pictures of Elizabeth that she disliked personally were destroyed, and prints that were approved were widely circulated so that people could see the magnificence of their queen. She was different to anyone they saw in their everyday life, and this magnificence was not accidental. She wanted them to see her as being something greater, something better. And this all links back, of course, to the great chain of being. She's at the very top, so she has to stand out as being this godlike persona. Again, just make sure you pause and add those couple of notes in red. So here's quite a bit of extra in red that I'd like you to add to your notes. So here's some more specific examples of Gloriana. So plays such as Shakespeare's Richard III, which portrayed the Tudors in a positive light. Richard III, he was seen as someone who had stolen the throne, was an evil king, and it was Richard III that Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, defeated in battle to become king. So it was really important for the Tudors to show Richard as being bad and evil, a child killer, someone who was absolutely without positive qualities. Because if they showed him as being so terribly, terribly bad, that made it look as if the Tudors had rescued the nation from this dreadful, dreadful monarch. And so many of Shakespeare's plays alluded to the evils of kings of the past and yet the glories of the current monarchs. Also at this time, and this was particularly important, the government took control of the new printing press. So the printing presses had emerged in the previous century, but were now being very, very widely used across the country. And this allowed books to be printed much more cheaply, much more easily, and of course, much more quickly. What this meant was there were more books out there in circulation. It meant that more people could afford them. That links to education that we're going to have a look at in a little while. More people could read. And so it was really important for Elizabeth and her government that they made sure that what they were reading was strictly controlled. So as they were reading things, again, it was enforcing, number one, the great chain of being, but also Elizabeth's position and status. So the most widely read book of Elizabeth's reign was John Foxe's Book of Martyrs. This book demonised Elizabeth's predecessor and sister Mary I and flattered Elizabeth. Essentially, this was all about how Elizabeth had got it right in terms of religion, about how she had gone that correct way. And obviously, we know that she followed that middle way in terms of religion and tried not to offend the Catholics and bring in lots of Protestant ideas and structures, but not in a way that would threaten Catholics. Whereas Mary I, of course, had killed Protestants who stood up against her. In the Book of Martyrs, it was said that she'd rescued England from terrible Catholic threats. In fact, Mary's reputation as Bloody Mary owes much to Fox. The reason we see Mary as such a bad queen is partially because of this propaganda. Pause this video now and take some time to jot down these notes. So what was particularly good at this time? What were the accomplishments of this so-called Golden Age? Well, first of all, we're starting with peace, power and pride. Before the Tudors, I just mentioned about Richard III, there was conflict over the throne. There'd been civil war and the Wars of the Roses throughout the middle to later 1400s, and the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI and Mary I had brought political stability, but religious turmoil. So they'd had political turmoil in the century before, which was eased by Henry VII, and then they'd had this religious turmoil that started, of course, with the Reformation, the break from Rome under Henry VIII. And of course, then we had lots of changes in religion and switches back. What Elizabeth did was she brought stability and security. England's growing wealth and military success made Elizabeth's subjects proud. People began to be proud of being English. England had not been seen as a great and glorious country before this point. The defeat of the Armada in 1588 really presented a turning point where the people of England felt that they were special and chosen. Another thing that changed at this point and is seen as an accomplishment of the Golden Age is the real growth in fashion. The gentry, who we've seen before, this group that are on the rise and that Elizabeth was promoting and patronising and trying to make sure that they were loyal to her, they helped drive the new clothing fashions. Because they had this disposable income, lots more money, fashion became this important symbol of a person's status. The rich used their money to buy expensive clothes in the latest fashions rather. But clothes were considered so important in this reign that some new laws, called the Statutes of Apparel, were passed in 1574. These laws strictly controlled the clothes that people were allowed to wear, depending on their social rank. So only certain people would be allowed to wear velvets and silks. Only certain people were allowed to wear certain colours, such as the very bright blues and the purples and the reds. So Elizabeth wanted to keep that status and keep that great chain of being absolutely in place, despite the fact that she was allowing some people to grow in terms of wealth and status. So more accomplishments of the Golden Age then. So maths, science and technology. John Dee found ways of drawing maps more accurately and was interested in the ideas of proportion and symmetry. Obviously, all of this was going to lead to improvements in terms of navigation, exploration, which is also an important part of this Golden Age. Important scientific discoveries about the planets and the human body were being made in Europe. And this led to more rational explanations for the human body and illnesses. And therefore, there were breakthroughs in terms, or the beginnings at least, of breakthroughs in the understanding of what caused people to become ill. People are really searching for real and scientific answers rather than just looking for God, superstition to give them the answers to everything. There were also breakthroughs in navigation and astronomy. These aided the voyages of exploration. And of course, the improved printing presses meant that new ideas were spread more quickly. This was absolutely vital. So ideas that were being discovered in Italy, in Spain, were spreading very rapidly into England at this time. And of course, it worked the other way around as well. So people were learning from each other in this Renaissance age. Art as well was a big movement at this time. Portraits, including detailed miniature ones, these were the things that were very, very popular at the time, became very popular and often contained symbolism. So these little miniatures, these were so popular, first of all, because you had to be pretty well off to be able to afford them because they were such delicate and skilled work, but also they were portable wealth. You didn't need someone to come to your home for you to be able to show off your wealth. You could carry your little miniatures with you, and then you were able to show people, oh, look at what I've got, and impress people. Decorative silverware and textiles became important signs of wealth and culture and were seen in the homes of the rich. They were also, these textiles were very important because they were portable as well. So it was quite difficult to transport paintings around, but textiles could be rolled up, even if they took up a whole wall in a massive room, roll them up and move them into your other home as well. They're also quite important for heat and warmth as well. So lots of kind of things that were making homes more comfortable, but also this link to science as well, and maths and technology. Okay, quite a bit more to add from this slide, as you can notice there with all this stuff in red at the second half of the slide. Please make sure you use your post-it notes or wherever else you're putting your extra notes. So literature, drama and the theatre. Some of the greatest poetry, literature and drama in our history comes from Elizabeth's reign. The theatre burst into life with the great plays of Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare. Edmund Spenser wrote a superb poem called The Faerie Queene to celebrate Elizabeth's reign. This links back to what we were talking earlier about the cult of Elizabeth and Gloriana and the propaganda. People who were flattering Elizabeth were able to become quite wealthy through that. So Spenser, because of writing this poem, he received an annual pension, an annual payoff from the Queen because he'd written such a flattering portrait of her. Shakespeare wrote beautiful sonnets as well as plays. So this was a time when England kind of led the world in terms of literature. And obviously you know lots about Shakespeare, but it's important to make sure you remember a couple of these other names as well. The theatre was a particularly important Elizabethan development. The first permanent theatres were built in this particular period. Before this, essentially theatres were travelling places. They'd go into the courtyard of an inn, a pub, or whatever, and people would set up there and perform. This is where we're moving to these purpose-built theatres, permanent ones, which could then attract thousands of people to come and watch shows. The first theatre was very nicely named The Theatre and was built in 1576. The Globe followed in 1599, and this is where Shakespeare really made his name. The theatres were built outside London's walls as they were worried that theatres encouraged crime and the plague. London's authorities wanted theatres closed. Puritans, those incredibly strict Protestants, also opposed theatres as they thought they encouraged sinful behaviour. You'd have people like prostitutes at the theatre, obviously trying to tout for business. You'd have pickpockets and criminality going on there. So this was seen by the Puritans as an encouragement of this kind of behaviour, and they wanted it to be shut down. So one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning of this video was having an understanding of how some people challenged some of the ideas of the Golden Age, and the Puritans are a particular example of this. But in general, the theatre was very popular. So despite the Puritans saying this is a place for sin, the vast majority of the population, in particular London, where these permanent theatres were, they were very happy with the theatre. So about 15,000 people were going every week to see the theatre in 1595. Prices varied, and even really quite poor people were able to go and watch a show occasionally. The rich sat in these covered, tiered galleries. The centre was an unroofed pit where the poor, who were known as the groundlings, they stood. It was open to the elements. The plays were shown during the daytime because they didn't have any way of properly lighting up at night. And they were obviously open to the weather in that. Themes of the plays reflected Elizabeth's interests, so romance, magic, history, but again, linking back to that propaganda and the control of what was being shown to people. Elizabeth's Privy Council had to approve all plays. So plays like The Isle of Dogs, we don't know what it was about, but we know that was banned and that the Privy Council did not see it as being something particularly that they could promote. The Queen didn't go to the theatre though, so the theatre was for everybody else. Actors performed for her at court. So they came to one of her palaces, one of her homes, and before her, she loved the theatre. She really encouraged the theatre. She encouraged drama, acting. She found it incredibly amusing. She wanted to be entertained. She liked the tragedies as well. So she was very interested in the development of this particular part of the Golden Age. This is another one where you're going to have to add a little bit more onto your post-it notes. So architecture. This particular period under Elizabeth was known as the Great Rebuilding. So what you got at this point was new extravagant houses that were built to reflect the wealth and stability of the age. Prior to this, rich people would build a castle. But because England was now safe from invasion, and because things were so stable in the country, people built these grand country houses that didn't need massive walls, that didn't need moats and fortifications. These were places where people could really show off how cultured, how learned, how wonderful they were. So more people, and particularly from the gentry, built themselves new houses with upstairs rooms. So now they were getting, again, this links to technology, science, etc. New building methods were being discovered all of the time. So more upstairs rooms, glass windows. This was, to show off how much glass you could have was a real status symbol. Fireplaces, multiple fireplaces. Rather than just having one great hall with a big fire in it now, you could have a fire in many, many rooms around your house. So what this meant was that houses were being built for comfort, for status. The greatest English architect was a man called Robert Smithson, and he designed, as you can see there on the picture, Hardwicke Hall. Now, Hardwicke Hall was known as having more window than wall, because if you can see by the picture there, the amount of glass there on the front of the home. What you can also see is influences there coming over from Renaissance Italy. It was all about proportion. It was all about it being beautiful to look at, to be symmetrical. And the more that your house looked like this, kind of like a Renaissance palace, the more your status was being shown. So just as I've alluded to before, for the first time, homes were not being built for defence with moats and bridges. They were being built with fashionable features, such as intricate chimneys, not just having a chimney, but a beautiful chimney, because it wasn't just about it being useful. It was also about showing, look, this person can't just build a chimney, they can make a beautiful one. Oak panelling, tapestries, glass. They had decorative gardens, sometimes designed by separate architects or architects that specialised just in beautiful ornamental gardens. They were designed to amaze with their scale and their style. Many could afford this, and they benefited from the rising food prices and exploration, of course, as we mentioned earlier, those rising rents from houses and businesses that they owned in the towns, and of course from the increasing trade prices. And as I've mentioned before as well, influenced by Renaissance architecture. So these best architects of the day, many of them had been to Italy or they'd studied Italian architecture, and it was all built on stuff that was coming out of the centre of the Renaissance in Italy. And we're still on accomplishments of the Golden Age. We can really see there's lots of arguments to say that this was a time where things were really changing for the better, and that there were lots and lots of improvements. So if we have a look here, you can see you're going to have to add again some of the stuff in red. So education. So I've talked about this a little bit before when I was talking about the pre-printing press and propaganda and this cult of Elizabeth. So this was being seen as increasingly important. Wealthy boys and some girls received an education prior to this period, but the poor did not. But there were lots of new grammar schools popping up. Now, what these were doing was helping kind of the middling people to get that education. So people who had previously not been wealthy enough to send their children off to a private school, a public school, they now were able to send them to the local grammar school. So new schools were set up offering a broader curriculum. English people were becoming better educated. This was seen as crucial for bettering yourself and moving up the social ladder. So again, looking at that chain of being and people wanting to kind of fudge that a little bit and move around. At the start of the 1500s, around 1 in 10 men could read and write. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, it was around 1 in 4. So you can see the massive improvement of literacy here, and that again links back to the printing press, but it also links back to this drive from the government to educate more of the people. The more people that you could educate, the more people that you were actually going to be able to indoctrinate with propaganda about how wonderful the Queen was. Exploration. So Europeans discovered new lands and new peoples. Spain and Portugal had dominated exploration, but in Elizabeth's reign there were English achievements like Drake's circumnavigation around the world, and England becoming this major player and a major world power. Make sure you add to your notes now. So why was it not a golden age at this point? Well, there were still things like blood sports, dog fighting, bear baiting. These were very popular. These were a very medieval type of entertainment, and maybe showed that things hadn't moved as forward as maybe we first think. Torture and brutal execution were still being used by the government. Most people were poor, and the great chain of being taught them they should expect nothing more. There was a real issue with poverty in this period. We're going to have a look at that more in a minute. Life expectancy remained low and medical treatment was ineffective. I mentioned before they were starting to look for natural cures and causes of disease, but they didn't really find them in this period. Some scientific practices were questionable as well. So some people believed in alchemy, turning cheap metal into gold, and astrology, using the planets to predict the future. And these were very popular at the time, but again, this was related to ideas that were really non-scientific and relating to superstition, really, and none of them were really possible. Okay, so you're going to need your second sheet now, and this is the one that's on poverty. We're in the top left-hand box of your A3 sheet on poverty. So some of the causes of poverty were unavoidable, but Elizabeth could have done more to prevent it. We're going to start off by looking at the actions of previous monarchs. This is not the fault of Elizabeth. So Henry VIII limited the right of nobles to hold private armies, fearing they might be a threat to his throne. This left many soldiers without work. These people had traditionally worked for the local nobility. As part of this army, they now had to find alternative employment. He also closed down the monasteries in the 1530s. The monks, nuns, and other church employees were left with nowhere to live or work. But even more serious and important with this was that the monasteries had traditionally helped the poor. They'd given out charity, usually in the form of food, sometimes in the form of medical help, to the poor on a really regular basis. Now on your sheet you might say Henry VII here, it should say Henry VIII. Henry VIII had reduced the value of money by melting down coins to use the gold and silver to pay for his wars and then issuing new ones with less precious metal. Well, that had caused inflation, that had caused problems because this debasement of the coinage, as it was known, people knew that there was less gold, there was less silver in the coins, and therefore they saw them as being worth less, and therefore people who were charging money for things, traders, were saying, well, no, I need 2 coins rather than 1, and so prices of everything went up. Changes in agriculture under Elizabeth. This was something that had been going on for the whole period. It begun really under Henry VII in the late 1400s, but there were growing numbers of enclosures. This was where landlords were able to enclose their land, keep sheep on them, rather than growing crops. This system meant that fewer farm workers were needed, and this led to greater unemployment. And this was because at the time, sheep farming to make wool and cloth had been increasingly profitable. So rather than growing food, which required an awful lot of work and lots of workers, those people who owned lots of land realised that actually sheep farming was much better, and this led to real great unemployment. Many of those unemployed farm workers then headed to the towns and cities to look for work, and there weren't enough jobs to go round, especially due to population increase at this time. So continuing with causes of poverty then, population increase under Elizabeth. We've just seen how the population increase had a problem with unemployment. The population rose from around 2.8 million to 4 million during Elizabeth's reign. This placed real pressure on resources, as this was a 43% rise in population. The shortage of homes gave the power to landlords to increase rents. This was called rack renting, so putting up the prices constantly, and it meant there was real hardship for those who lived in the towns. Bad luck. This was another cause of poverty. These were things that were really out of the control of anybody. There'd been massive outbreaks of flu in this period. So one of them in 1556, so 2 years before Elizabeth came to the throne, killed around 200,000 people. When you look at what the population was, so around 2.8 million at that point, that's a huge, huge amount, including many farm workers. And of course, that meant that there were some shortages on the farms. Bad harvest between 1594 and 1598, that's due to weather, etc., led to food shortages and starvation. And this again led to increased prices, which had already gone up. Monopolies. This was to do with Elizabeth herself. In the 1590s, Elizabeth made money by selling monopolies. She sometimes did it for money, she sometimes did it to get loyalty, and these gave individual nobles and merchants, members of the gentry, the sole right to produce or sell specific goods. Monopolies were unpopular because they caused prices to rise further. Because if you were someone who had the sole right to sell a particular item, you decided the price. You could decide whatever price you wanted to, because nobody else was going to be in competition with you or sell it for a cheaper price. So we can see that there was lots of reasons for the growth of poverty. So how do people feel about poor? Well, the poor. Well, this has been something that people have felt this way about the poor for many generations. This is new to Elizabeth. They essentially separated them into two different groups: the deserving and the undeserving. So deserving poor, essentially gentry, the nobles, people at the top of society, believed that it was simply that these people were better than the poor, and they believed it was their duty to help those in society who deserved help. It wasn't their fault that they were poor. So people who were aged, so old people, blind, orphans, people too ill to look after themselves, all of those kind of people deserved help and support, as they were not responsible for their own poverty. And charities for the poor grew, and this was through individual donations from members of the gentry, members of the nobility, and almshouses were established. So places like Burley's almshouses in Stamford. The second group was the undeserving or idle poor, the lazy poor. Some people were seen as undeserving of any help. So whilst you have that group of the deserving poor, that the rich will do anything to help because they hadn't created their situation, you've got this other group that people said were fit and strong but deliberately avoided work. Some of these people were vagabonds and travelled from place to place, and many of the people who had money were absolutely terrified of them, and they gave them food and money to get rid of them. They were homeless, and people saw them as immoral and criminal. And people wanted to stamp down on this. They wanted to make sure that those who could work were working and were going to be punished if they weren't. So before Elizabeth, there were various measures to tackle and challenge the poor, such as beggars to be put in the stocks, whipped and sent home to the place of their birth. In 1531, those generally unable to work were allowed to beg, and unlicensed beggars were punished. And then in 1547, beggars could be branded with the letter V on their forehead as an example to everybody else, and of course punished as well for that. So this is how people felt about the poor in this period. So you might want to pause this in a second because there's quite a lot to add on this one. So why were Elizabethans so worried about poverty? Well, they were worried because they believe it created disease. People believe that wandering beggars spread disease like the plague from place to place. They were also worried that it encouraged crime. Beggars often turned to crime. There was no police force to catch criminals, just as the police were responsible for keeping law and order and thought that beggars were a serious threat. There were seen to be more and more of them in the towns and cities. Rebellions. In the 16th century, so the 1500s government, they were always worried about the danger of rebellion. They did not have a permanent army to deal with the situation if a rebellion did happen. Rising numbers of poor people made the threat of rebellion even greater. They feared if they all clubbed together, if they all started complaining the government weren't doing enough to help them, that could really cause problems. And the social order. Large numbers of discontented beggars wandering around the countryside threatened the social order. It looked as if the authorities weren't doing a good job in controlling them. And if they weren't doing a decent job at controlling them, then maybe the divine order wasn't working. So Elizabeth's early measures then. Elizabeth thought that there were more important problems such as religion and foreign policy in the early part of her reign, and she put her personal attention into those matters. So William Cecil and other ministers were left to deal with poverty in the early part of her reign, and they did bring in laws in 1563, 1572 and 1576, such as the Act for Setting the Poor on Work. This was about forcing those idle or those undeserving poor into actually working for a living. Make sure you pause this now and jot down as much of this as you can. So here's a little bit more about that 1576 Act for Setting the Poor on Work. So Elizabeth and the Privy Council discussed it many times, but again, as I said on the last slide, she wasn't as interested in this as she was in other areas. So this particular law placed responsibility on local authorities, in other words, local areas, local parishes, and they said that you have to decide what is to be done with them. Most local authorities, though, didn't do enough. Some did. So Ipswich is a really positive example of a local authority that did. They opened a hospital specific to help poor and sick people. They provided a youth training scheme. This was all about trying to get young people into apprenticeships so they would have a trade and therefore they could avoid poverty in their later life. In Norwich, they also set up a tax to help fund care for the vulnerable. York is an example of where they did practically nothing to help the poor. So the 1576 Act was about, trying to get people into apprenticeships, try and help people out, to try and again make sure that people were responsible for themselves. But because it was put on local authorities, there wasn't a national system. There wasn't a really proper look at what should be done about the poor. By 1601, there was more of a crisis in terms of poverty. The 1590s have been an absolutely dreadful time for the poor. There've been famine, harvests, also, price rises, inflation. Things have got really out of control. So in 1601, Elizabeth introduced her Poor Law. So this was a new nationwide compulsory system of poor relief. So the Justices of the Peace, the JPs, had to appoint 4 overseers of the poor in each small area, each parish. The overseers had to make sure that orphan children had apprenticeships. This was about looking at their long-term futures, making sure they weren't going to fall into poverty in the future. They also provided places for the able-bodied poor to get work in the workhouses, and they were paid a very small wage from the poor rate. This was about showing them you don't get handouts for nothing. If you're going to, live, you have to contribute. People who were too old or sick to work were to have almshouses to live in, so they weren't going to be forced to do manual labour. Begging from this point was strictly forbidden. Anyone found begging was to be whipped until his back be bloody and then returned to his hometown. If this was known, and then he was placed in a house of correction, a workhouse. The JPs had to make sure that everyone paid this tax, this poor rate, to help pay for the measures, and anyone who refused could be imprisoned. So this was all about saying, yes, some places have got it right, like Ipswich, where they are, setting on apprenticeships, etc., and trying to help the poor, but actually the system wasn't working in enough places. So this was about centralisation. What was good about this Poor Law? Well, this was the first time that the central government had really taken the responsibility for its people. And this is when this tax, this poor rate, was being collected. So it was about this national system. So the Poor Law brought together previous government and local measures. It lasted until 1834, over 200 years of this particular Poor Law. So there must have been something about it that worked if it didn't need revising until that point. And the poor didn't rebel. Remember, one of the real fears of the wealthy was there would be rebellion from down below because they'd become too dissatisfied. Well, that never happened. So maybe the Poor Law at least did a little bit of its job. But it certainly has its limitations. Some argue the extent of poverty has been exaggerated and the Poor Law was not actually used that much. Poverty continued to increase, and it didn't challenge attitudes towards poverty. There was still this focus on punishment, on those undeserving poor, forcing them into these workhouses, which were little better than going to prison. Okay, we're on our final part of the Golden Age now, looking at explorers. So why did Elizabethan explorers? Quite a lot for you to add on this particular slide. So as well as a golden age, Elizabeth's reign had been called an age of discovery. Although other countries, particularly Spain and Portugal, played a major role in exploring the world, it was England that led the world at this particular point. Reasons for exploration then. Ideas of the Renaissance. This was a period of new ideas and explanation, and it fitted it perfectly. This was a time when people wanted to know more about the world. So exploration absolutely fits into that. New inventions. Better designed ships with triangular sails called lateens provided longer and faster voyages. Better weapons such as cannons made it easier to explore hostile waters, and the astrolabe made circumnavigation more accurate. Of course, we've already seen how there were more accurate maps, etc. Another reason for exploration was it was actually a good thing because you might make a lot of money. There was this prospect of economic gain. New trade routes were needed due to the collapse of Antwerp markets. New trade companies helped monopolise trade routes and bring wealth. And patriotism and natural glory. Exploration brought national glory through the establishment of new colonies and helped competition with rivals like the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, England don't establish proper colonies in this period, but we set up to do that. So the start of England being this great country of empire, the seeds are established at this point. One of the people you need to know about exploration in this period is Sir Francis Drake. So Drake became the most famous English explorer and privateer pirate really in this particular time. So why did he want to do it? Well, it links to what we've just said on the last slide. Wealth, glory. He was incredibly patriotic. He wanted to discover new territory for England. He hated the Spanish and he wanted revenge on them for destroying his cousins, John Hawkins, who we'll look at in a moment, ships. So what did he do? Well, in 1572, he captured £40,000 worth of Spanish silver when he attacked, I should say, rather than attached, Spanish treasure ships. He became rich and famous and got financed by powerful people at court, including Elizabeth. People funded these journeys hoping that they would make some money out of it. It was a bit of a gamble investing in a voyage because you could lose everything, because ships did get lost at sea, never came back, ships were destroyed, sank, etc. So it was a way to make really good money, but it was also a big gamble. But the thing that Sir Francis Drake is probably most known for is his circumnavigation of the globe. In other words, going all the way around. When he returned, he circumnavigated the globe. He was the first Englishman to do this and the second person to do this. Magellan had done this 50 years ago, 50 years before this, prior to this. He returned with an estimated £400,000 worth of treasure captured from the Spanish. The Queen was delighted and made a huge fortune out of this. She got money, he got money, everybody, and the investors got money, everybody was happy. The Spanish ambassador wanted him punished because obviously he had stolen from them, but she knighted him in 1581. He later played a key role in the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The Armada was delayed by an English attack on Cadiz harbour in 1587, where Drake made off with gold treasures and destroyed over 100 Spanish ships. This is one of the reasons why England won the Spanish Armada, or defeated the Spanish Armada. The English saw him as a hero. The Spanish hated him and called him the Master Thief of the New World. He, of course, loved that title. I mentioned John Hawkins on the last slide as being the cousin of Sir Francis Drake. He was a respected sailor and courtier. He was a successful privateer and he sought to have brought tobacco to England. He hated the Spanish as he illegally traded with their empire, and they responded by sinking his ships and killing 200 of his men. Make sure you add that to your notes in a moment. He was responsible for England's involvement in the slave trade. In 1564, he kidnapped several hundred West Africans and sold them in South America. Obviously, this is a bit of a horrible stain on England, the fact that the slave trade, in terms of taking Africans to the New World and forcing them to work, was a terrible, terrible thing. But at this time, it was seen as being a really good thing because it allowed the English to make money from the New World. So something that today we rightly see as being awful, but something that he was seen as a bit of a hero for at the time. He also had a role in defeating the Spanish Armada. He was responsible for building up the navy, he improved ship design, and commanded it against the Spanish Armada. He made ships lighter and more manoeuvrable, and he built 24 of these battleships for Elizabeth, and they helped make a difference when the Armada arrived on English shores. So he helped this command against the Armada. His great leadership and new weaponry, in combination with Drake and Effingham, helped England win. So he was another person that's seen as important in both the Armada for his skills, but also as someone who brought wealth to England through being a privateer and a sailor. The final of our important sailors is Sir Walter Raleigh. So he was a famous sailor, explorer and courtier. He was given royal permission to explore the Americas, the New World as it was known at the time, in 1584. He'd be allowed to colonise or take ownership of any land that was not ruled by a Christian. And that, of course, was most of the New World at this point. In return, he had to give Elizabeth 1/5 of all the gold and silver he found there. He didn't sail himself, but he sent others to explore and establish colonies in the New World. An area in America was called Virginia to honour Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. He's believed to have introduced potatoes to England, a very, very important thing, and both his attempts to set up a colony failed. In 1585, the first settlers faced food shortages in Roanoke, and they left a year later. The second group disappeared without trace. So this was not a period where England were successfully colonising the Americas. It wasn't until the 1600s that really began. So why did he fail? Well, poor planning, bad luck. Only 1 out of his 7 ships actually made it due to bad weather, lack of supplies, funds too limited. So as I said, no colony successfully established in this time. In 1595, Raleigh led another unsuccessful expedition to search for the supposed city of gold, El Dorado, in South America. This was a legendary city. Everybody was trying to discover it. It didn't really exist, and he failed again. So Walter Raleigh is important because he was the person that was really trying to find these colonies. And again, despite the fact he's failed, it doesn't really matter, because what he does is he kind of sets the scene for the people who are going to be more successful over the next 100 years. So what were the consequences of exploration? Well, in the short term, it increased the hostility between Spain and England. This was another one of the background causes of the Spanish deciding to come and attack England in 1588, because the Spanish were absolutely sick and tired of the English privateers and the disrespect to their colonies as well. It made heroes of men such as Drake and brought great wealth to merchants and nobles who sponsored the voyages. And that, of course, links to our golden age as well, those people that spend on all that art and their homes, etc. Glory and riches, one, helped Elizabeth's magnificent personal image. She, of course, was the monarch who was actively encouraging this piracy, this privateering, and also this exploration and trade. And it all contributed to this idea of this being a golden age, of England being a little bit ahead of the game, really. The long-term impact. Well, Elizabeth's reign provided the foundation on which Britain's later position as a global superpower was built. As I mentioned, they didn't establish any colonies at this period, but they laid the seeds for this. Economically, Britain was becoming much richer through establishing trade links across the world, and these only grew in the next century. Militarily, it led to the development of a powerful navy, which dominated the seas until the 20th century. Britain's, kind of role as being the naval power was established at this point. And politically, it led to the establishment of the colonies that eventually covered a quarter of the globe. Now, I'm not going to read through this, but if these are notes that you don't have, it might be a good idea to jot down some of these key events from this period. This covers all the different areas in terms of the Golden Age, in terms of poverty, and in terms of exploration. It might be a good idea, once you've gone through this, once you've made yourself some resources like a mind map, like a revision clock, or some flashcards, whatever it is that you find is the best way of learning the stuff, it might be a really good idea to test yourself using the short answer tests. If you don't have a copy of these, please make sure you ask your teacher.